Well, exactly. Whether it's the First Nations are unlikely to form an allegiance with any political party, but we work very closely with First Nations. One of the things is the provincial government licenses the individual fish farms, but at a federal level, it's the Department of Fisheries and Oceans that actually is supposed to be regulating for the protection of the health for wild salmon. So we have a really interesting opportunity, and it's the Cohen Commission report. And in response to Salmon Confidential being shown, I'm reminding people that and I'm sure you're familiar with the Cohen Commission report, that the interesting thing here is Stephen Harper commissioned this report, put Mr. Justice Bruce Cohen in charge of a commission of inquiry. They did tremendous work, published a report in 4 big volumes on the threats to wild salmon. And a lot of what they looked at was Alexander Morton's stuff on fish farms and contamination. So to remind you of Cohen's conclusions, it was that there was no one smoking gun in relation to the collapse of salmon populations, particularly in the Fraser River, particularly in 2009. But there were many, many causes, from bad logging practices to ground-based sources of marine pollution, to climate change, to fish farms. And Cohen's report issued, I don't know, it's over 100 very specific recommendations, and one of them was that fish farms should be removed on the BC coastline in the migratory path of wild salmon. Now, what's extraordinary about this is that the convention in government, and I've got to double check this because I used to think it was a binding like a law that you couldn't get away with ignoring it, was the minister responsible for an area such as the Cohen Commission report, Minister for Fisheries and Oceans, is required to provide a response within either 30 or 60 days. And to refresh your memory, in case you've forgotten, because I know I did, I had to go back up and look it up, Cohen Commission report came out in October of last year, and there's been no response from the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. So I would urge all of you who saw Salmon Confidential to use this as a hook. Letters to the editor of newspapers across the country, letters to the Minister of Fisheries, whose name is Gail Shea from Prince Edward Island, commentary wherever you can make your voices heard to say, how can it be that the Harper administration, obviously Stephen Harper consistently sees himself as above the law. Doesn't pay attention. Supreme Court said they were violating the rights of Omar Khadr. So who cares? It's just a court ruling. Harper ignored it. We've had a lot of the Speaker of the House said it's contempt of Parliament to refuse to share with Parliament the Afghan detainee documents. Right? We tend to lose track of this, but guess what? They still haven't tabled the Afghan detainee documents. We had an election over that in spring of 2011. But when the election was over, Harper and Baird said, we've spent a lot of money giving you some of the documents. We're not going to spend any more money giving you all of them. And so again, here we are on the Cohen Commission report. I certainly plan on doing quite a lot when we get to the anniversary date. I think it will break. I've got to double check my research on this before I say it, but I don't think there's ever been a government in the history of Canada that has ignored a Royal Commission and not reported on time, a response to the recommendations. The response to the recommendations should be the fish farms that now exist in the migratory path of wild salmon along the BC coast have to be removed. And then DFO would have to go to the BC government and figure out, what do we do to remove? Do we compensate these guys? What do we do? But we've just had I think it was well over $20 million spent by the Cohen Commission to develop a set of recommendations. I certainly didn't think that something of that significance could be ignored. But so far, it has been. So that's where we are on. And the other thing we can do about wild salmon in terms of allegiances is I am working on the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which was also featured, shall we say, in that documentary. They continue to be just on the side of the fish farms since that film. And I imagine, did Twyla mention to you, was she here when they showed the film, the filmmaker? She must have told you that veterinary lab and PEI has been shut down. So, people speak out at their peril when they're in the industry. But also, DFO and the FIA both have a statutory conflict of interest. Built into the legislation for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is, and this certainly predates Harper, this was under Crenton, that the Food Inspection Agency by law must monitor food safety in Canada and also must promote exports of Canadian foodstuffs around the world. So this is why when there was listeriosis at Maple Leaf, they took a while to decide what to say because they don't want to falsely smear a Canadian brand that they need to export. Ditto on XL beef and E. coli. The DFO conflict of interest is this. DFO is responsible for maintaining the ecological integrity of fish habitat, at least that's what they're supposed to do, even after Harper wrecked the Fisheries Act in relation to temporary destruction of habitat. You can now destroy habitat on a temporary basis. Permanent destruction of habitat, though, is still against the law as long as the fish is commercial, aboriginal, or recreationally fished. So that clears the way for really destroying everything in a region that isn't fished. But certainly anything to do with West Coast wild salmon is commercial and recreational and definitely aboriginal. So, and by the way, it was revealed just at the very end of my time in Parliament in June. A reporter called me, they'd gotten access to information. The terminology that the Fisheries Act should be changed so that it doesn't protect all fisheries, but would protect fish that were commercial, aboriginal, recreational, was language that came directly from briefs to DFO from industry reps. So, so DFO has the responsibility still to protect habitat for salmon. It's the bottom line. But they also have a mandate to promote fish aquaculture. So there's a lot of things that are not just the current Harper administration, but predate that and represent basically the fixes in most levels of food. Look, food production in Canada has, for several prime ministers' administrations, been primarily about promoting profits for Cargill, Monsanto, Maple Leaf, whatever, and not a priority for Canadian food safety, and certainly not a priority for local food security. It's been about increasing our exports and improving profits for transnationals. And there's so many examples of this, so it may sound like I've made a bold statement that's unfair, but that's my observation of the food system in Canada, is that it's about agribusiness and food exports, and the model around which the regulations are formed is not about wholesome, healthy food, which can also help explain why it is why the health indicators for young Canadians, for childhood obesity and diabetes and heart disease, why it is that Canadian children are, if they were an animal population as opposed to human children. If you were a wildlife biologist and you were studying the young of our particular species, you'd be saying there's something wrong with the young of that species. They're showing a lot of heart disease, diabetes, obesity, etc. And some of that is that children are increasingly sedentary. But another big chunk of it is that they're not eating healthy food, because the profits for many different transnationals go up when foods are increasingly, junkified is a good word for it. Number one, the fish farms are primarily operated by Norwegian companies, and we do not have an investment state agreement with Norway, so that's one piece of good news. First Nations would be ideally placed to bring litigation against the fish farms for contamination of wild salmon with viruses and sea lice and so on. But any Canadian who wants to enforce the Fisheries Act and who makes direct personal observations of what's happening can go to the RCMP and ask for a private prosecution to enforce the Fisheries Act. The DFO has been so cut back. DFO Science, as you probably heard from the press conference the other day, the only really well-financed DFO research program at the moment is doing Enbridge's research on vitamin and diluent. Right. We've lost all the marine contaminants program science. We've lost all the freshwater science experiment at Lake Sarah. So there's a very significant cutbacks at DFO. We've lost all the DFO habitat guys for all of BC have been let go. So DFO is not enforcing the Fisheries Act, but the Fisheries Act is one of the few acts where there is a right of private prosecution by going to the RCMP and laying information and saying this is illegal, and that's a lot better than going to court, because you're not in the civil courts with a private lawsuit. You're actually trying to get a criminal enforcement. It could be tried. There certainly are environmental lawyers on Pender who might be able to get, I'm no longer a practicing lawyer, so I'm not in a position to offer legal advice, but David Boyd or Margot at Eco-Justice could probably give you a better idea of what was possible. I think it's long overdue that somebody haul these guys into court because of the various levels of contamination that are going on.